Go for liftoff in T-minus 30.
Stand by for further instructions, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment.
Secondary guidance systems engaged.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark.
All systems are a go. All systems are a go.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, you are over the target. You are authorized to fire at will.
Hey, thanks for stopping by Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. If you guys are noticing that it's a little bit late here in Minnesota, it's because I don't think I've ever done a stream this late at night, but it's well worth it. I would gladly do this again to be able to share this content with you. For once, oh, holy cow, I'm a mess. Oh, anyway, I've got John Ziegler with me, who is a journalist and an investigative, kind of a deep diver in as it regards Penn State and the Sandusky case. And so I'm sipping coffee so I can keep myself awake. I've been up since 5:45 this morning, and this is too important to ignore, so I'm going to kind of get straight to it. If you guys are interested, got coffee, I got merchandise. Remember, until the end of the month, I've got a fundraiser going on for my friend Dana, who is also my co-host for the Behind the Curtain podcast over on Rumble. The series that we're doing on Rumble, talking about COVID protocols and the impact and the effect that has on individuals who are hospitalized with the COOF. And that goes until the end of the month here. She's getting 15% of my proceeds. And if you're interested, if you buy merchandise or if you support me on Subscribestar, you will get to see if 15% of that go to her to help her legal defense fund or her case as she builds a case against the hospital that took punitive measures against her and her mother down there in Florida. The very compelling story. If you get a chance, go over to Rumble and look for the Behind the Curtain series. We have to do it on Rumble because YouTube likes to take us down everywhere else. Most of you are well aware of what happened over in Pennsylvania at Penn State with Joe Paterno and Jerry Sandusky and the people who were involved with that. Everybody's heard the story, and most of you formed your opinions well ahead of time before you really knew what was going on. And if you're like me, you hear stories about people who were abused, especially sexual abuse, and it's very easy to say to yourselves, oh man, that person needs to pay. We have ingrained in ourselves a mindset, which rightfully so, if someone abuses children, whether it be purely physical or sexual or even mental or emotional, we want them to pay the stiffest of penalties. The problem is that we don't always wait for a jury to come back and give us a decision. And sometimes even when a jury does come back, we don't always have all the facts. And as my guest tonight has pointed out, when you look at the O.J. Simpson case, that trial, and I remember where I was for all of that. I was stationed at Fort Bragg with the 82nd Airborne Division, and we were all glued to our radios or even to the TVs. We watched the world's slowest long police chase in the history of the world as that played out. We all remember the white Bronco, but most of us had an opinion there ahead of time. In the case of Jerry Sandusky, in the case of the Penn State, Joe Paterno, and the people that are involved, we didn't really wait for facts to come out. And when I heard John on with Tom Woods on his podcast, I said, oh, well, I'm going to give this some thought. And when I went into the podcast, I said, you're going to have to lay out some pretty clear evidence for me to be swayed that this individual is being, for lack of better terminology, set up or not guilty. And it didn't take me very long to understand very quickly that not everything that we heard about Penn State, not everything that we heard about Jerry Sandusky was factual or even close to being reality. And the further I got into the podcast, the more I listened, the more I realized that, as we've learned over the last few years, especially since 2020, a lot of the stuff that took place there, and as we've experienced recently, was a direct result of media interference. They set a narrative, they set a tone, and John does a great job in his show with his co-host Liz Habib. I think I'm saying her name right. Of laying out exactly what took place and exactly why we shouldn't rush to judgment or even preconceived notions and presuppositions of accusers always being right. So I'm going to bring John in, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about what brought him in and what got his attention on this, and then I'm going to have him point you to his podcast on this topic, so that you guys can listen and make up your own minds. That's what I want. I want you to make up your own minds. I want you to determine for yourselves, based on the evidence that John presents in his show, what the truth is. Because I'm going to tell you, if you formed your opinion on what was being portrayed in the media, you're probably going to have your worldview wrecked. John, thanks a lot for doing this. I know it's not quite as late for you as it is for me, but you have much younger children than I do, so you're probably twice as tired as I am. So thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So what made you take interest in Penn State and the Jerry Sandusky story and Joe Paterno? Because I know you started out to do not a podcast, but a documentary about Joe Paterno in particular, but it turned into an entire monster of research and investigation that I don't think even you were prepared for.
Yeah, I mean, if you had told me in November of 2011, when this story exploded on the national landscape, that in January 2023, I would still be talking about this after having done an epic podcast called With the Benefit of Hindsight that basically proved that the entire media narrative, including everything involving Jerry Sandusky's alleged guilt, was false, I would have taken pretty long odds on that. There was no chance of that happening. You asked the question how I got involved. In November of 2011, I was living, as I still am, in Southern California. I was a documentary filmmaker at that time with a legitimate career as a conservative documentary filmmaker. My most recent film had debuted live in the featured time slot on the Today Show in an interview that got rather contentious with Matt Lauer. And so, I had a legitimate career and following and was somewhat noteworthy in this realm. And I was watching what was unfolding in Happy Valley, Pennsylvania, in an incredibly short period of time, where the news media was telling us this story that made absolutely no sense to me. And it made no sense to me partially because I grew up in Pennsylvania, though nowhere near Happy Valley, in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And I had coached high school football in two different states. I'd written a book about a high school football team in Ohio, just across the river from Pennsylvania. I'd covered college and pro football. I was very familiar with Penn State's program and with Joe Paterno. And even without his reputation, Joe Paterno's reputation, which was absolutely sterling at the time, the story just didn't pass the BS test. And I was presuming that Jerry Sandusky was guilty. Let's be clear about that. I was open to the idea that maybe some of these allegations were exaggerated or, that maybe there were some misunderstandings involved, but it was obvious, to me at least, it seemed he had to be guilty of at least some, if not all, of what he was accused of. And that makes him a pedophile. And therefore I have no interest in defending him. But this idea, which is what we were told, that Joe Paterno and Penn State, including 3 very well-respected administrators, including the president of the university and the vice president of the university and the athletic director of the university, all with great reputations, decided to cover up the rape of a child in a Penn State shower that was allegedly committed by Jerry Sandusky when he was a former assistant coach at Penn State, made no sense to me. That was ludicrous. Now, you mentioned O.J. Simpson, and I think the context that you heard me reference O.J. Simpson, as I often do with the benefit of hindsight, is that sometimes things happen that make no sense. Like O.J. Simpson killing his wife and her friend who just happened to be coming along at the very wrong time. But when that occurs, there's evidence to support that. And when you learn more, there becomes some logic behind why OJ did what he did, although obviously it was horrendous and heinous and unforgivable, though somehow the jury got that one wrong. And I've used the OJ case in many ways to compare to the Sandusky case because you have 2 football figures, and yet the 2 cases couldn't be more different. In one situation, OJ, you have a mountain of evidence,
right?
And you have a major celebrity and massive media coverage that really kind of benefited from keeping alive this notion that he could be innocent. And then the jury completely butchers it. And after an incredibly long trial, declares him not guilty. In the Jerry Sandusky case, you have the exact opposite. A football figure with no celebrity. Jerry Sandusky actually suffered from the worst of all worlds because he was a known figure in football, which made him interesting to the media, but he had no following as a celebrity. There was no fan base.
He never starred in any movies.
Right. There was no, and he wasn't a good looking guy. And he looked like most people's view of a pedophile, would be or should be, I guess. And so, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but getting back to the core of your question, the reality is that my first focus was on Joe Paterno because there was no doubt in my mind that Joe Paterno was getting railroaded, and I wanted to find out what the real story was. So I started investigating it for the standpoint of doing a documentary film, which I did, called The Framing of Joe Paterno, which you can see. There's a couple different versions of it for free on YouTube, no commercials, no nothing. And they're very well done, but although they were done so long ago that they're nowhere near what my current view of the entire case was, because I did that documentary, before I had interviewed Jerry Sandusky in prison twice for a total of over 6 hours. And it was those 2 interviews that really changed, slowly but surely, my view of what really happened here. And what I eventually came to learn, and it's so tough for people who have not followed this case because they think this is as open and shut as it gets in the opposite direction. But I'm telling you, people, that there is absolutely, positively zero doubt in my mind that everybody at Penn State was innocent, because I know with absolute certitude that Jerry Sandusky was innocent as well. And by the way, I'm not alone in this belief or this conclusion. There are a lot of people who have no stake in this story, who are very credible, who have looked at it and come to very similar conclusions, although they don't have the guts to state it like I just did. But almost I don't know of anybody. I do not know of anybody who has objectively looked at the facts of the case and not concluded, at the very least, that the Sandusky trial was a travesty of injustice and that he is very likely innocent. I'm willing to go way beyond that because I am absolutely positive that he is innocent, and it's not even close. That's what's so difficult for the average person who, only heard what they, heard in the media 11, 12 years ago and never looked at it again, and thinks that someone who would question that must be a conspiracy nut. And I'm actually the opposite of a conspiracy theorist.
You emphasize that.
I despise conspiracies. I despise conspiracies.
You emphasize that over and over and over again throughout the course. I mean, you have, what is it, almost 100 and some hours of, with the benefit of hindsight, you emphasize that in almost every episode, that you despise conspiracies, to almost to the point where it's like, okay, so what's the point? And I think Liz, your the official host, because I think she's listed as the host and of the podcast, but she even asks about that on a couple of occasions, like, well, okay, but so what's the conspiracy here? And you tread really close to kind of saying it becomes very political, almost from the get on the show.
To be clear, when I say I can't stand conspiracies and there's no conspiracy here, there's no grand conspiracy where everybody who was involved in this got in a room or got on an email chain and discussed, okay, we're going to bring down Joe Paterno and Jerry Sandusky. Right. They could never have possibly have done it as efficiently as they did if there had been. The only way something like this works is if a perfect storm of circumstance occurs where simultaneously a lot of people with power have the same self-interest. And that's what happened here. Now, to be very clear and to be as honest as possible, technically a conspiracy, right, I guess, is two or more people. There were a couple of small conspiracies within this larger perfect storm. Like, for instance, I believe that victim number one, so-called victim number one, Aaron Fisher,
for sure, yep,
who was the only accuser in this case for over 2 years, and which is why the case was going to be dropped, because they couldn't find anyone to corroborate or back up his story. I believe he and his mother have, at some level, a conspiracy here with regard to what would happen if they made an allegation, and they've made millions of dollars from that allegation, against
massive millions.
Right. And so I think that there were a few small conspiracies like that, but there's no massive conspiracy here. And I don't believe in massive conspiracies because I don't believe human beings are capable of that. And I don't believe in this day and age, especially with social media, that you can hold a massive conspiracy together in the vast majority of cases, because it's too easy to shatter a conspiracy. And part of what there's a lot that holds this perfect storm together, but one of the main things that holds this perfect storm together, and people say all the time, well, then, if you're right, John, then why hasn't the case totally fallen apart? Why hasn't anyone come forward to admit that you're right? Or, where's your smoking gun? And I said, well, the problem here is that everybody involved in this case got paid millions and millions of dollars, and they didn't get it in one lump sum. They get it in installment payments, sometimes for many, many years, which I think was done on purpose. I think Penn State did that on purpose because they might have had a suspicion that if the money ran out, some of these guys might decide to actually tell the truth, and then they would have a problem. So, but the reality is, and unfortunately, we live in a world where you got to explain things in 30 seconds at most. It takes a podcast, like with the benefit of hindsight, which I think, I don't even know what it is. It depends on how you define the podcast. We have the actual episodes, and then we have all the raw interviews. We did something extraordinary. We did a lot of things that were extraordinary in this podcast, but one of the extraordinary things that we did was that we put all of the raw, unedited interviews that we did for this documentary series, this podcast series, and we put it at our website, framingpaterno.com. You see the URL there on your screen, and you can listen to all the raw interviews, just so to make sure people didn't think we edited anything out of context, or that we left things out that only we left things out that didn't fit our narrative or our agenda, whatever. It's all right there for anyone to listen to for free. Again, not even advertising on it. And so, so I don't know. I guess you could argue it's 80 to 100 hours of of content that's out there publicly under the umbrella of with the benefit of hindsight. And that's pretty much what it would take to fully prove the case here, because the burden of proof that is on my shoulders in this situation is so overwhelming, because no one wants to believe this, which is one of the more mind-blowing aspects of the whole case, because you would think that there would be people, a lot of people who would be like, thank God you're telling us no one was sexually abused and there was no cover-up and there was no crime. That's awesome news. But no one wants to hear that, because you have to accept a lot of very uncomfortable things, including the fact that the entire nation, the entire media industrial complex, the entire judicial system, threw 5, I believe, great men under the bus, destroyed their lives, and is going to have one of them die in all likelihood in prison, all while rewarding a bunch of scoundrels who were manipulated at best and were lying overtly at worst, along with their therapists and their plaintiffs' attorneys, all of whom made millions and millions of dollars from a lie. And of course, we saw, you mentioned COVID. I actually think the only thing that's happened in the last 12 years that has made my job easier in trying to prove this case to people is the COVID pandemic. I have found that to be palpable. And I actually thought there was a chance this might occur. But as you know, there's so many similarities between what happened with COVID and the moral panic and the media narrative and the overreaction and the setting of narratives and the being afraid to admit you're wrong and doubling, tripling, and quadrupling down on a lie. All of that is incredibly similar to what happened in the Penn State case. And it's not a coincidence that if you look at my commentary on the pandemic, I believe I was way, way ahead of the curve because I had already seen this movie before. I had seen it with Penn State, and I saw it coming down the pike a mile away. Again, not a conspiracy, although there might have been some larger conspiracies with regard to COVID that I'm at least open to, but mostly just a perfect storm of self-interest that it was remarkably similar to what happened with Penn State. So, you know, when people say to me, well, how in the world could all of this have happened? It's so insane that Penn State would plead guilty and that they'd fire Joe Paterno and the 3 administrators would end up getting convicted of misdemeanors and Sandusky would be put away for life. How could all of that happen on a lie? And I say, well, how could the United States of America, a country based on freedom and liberty and bravery, somehow get duped into mandating masks that don't work on a virus for 2 years? I mean, how could that happen? Well, it's a very similar dynamic. I mean, unfortunately, that's the world we're living in now. And just very few people are willing to admit it.
Do you mentioned the 5 administrators who
I mentioned 5 great men. Sandusky, Paterno, and the 3 administrators, Graham Spanier, Gary Schultz, and Tim Curley. All of them basically had their lives destroyed in various ways, and all of them are totally innocent. All of them had tremendous reputations before this happened.
Four of those, not counting Sandusky, obviously, and I'm not trying to throw Jerry under the bus, but 4 of those were never in any way, shape, or form ever accused of anything substantive in the sense of they knew something was going on. It was merely accusations. And in the case of Graham Spanier, it was, you didn't do enough when you should have done more.
Well, I mean, look, I could have done an entire podcast just on the allegations involving the administrators, and that would have been far less controversial and probably would have been far easier. But in my view, this whole story, everything is connected, and you need all the pieces. And we start very early on with the benefit of hindsight, talking about the administrators and how absurd the allegations are against them. Most people, I'm sure, don't know that what ended up happening with the administrators was a far cry from the original allegations. When the story broke in November 2011, 2 of the administrators, Tim Curley and Gary Schultz, were were charged with very serious crimes of perjury and endangering children, and these were felonies, and they were horrific allegations that they had engaged purposefully in a cover-up of Jerry Sandusky's child sex abuse. And even then, I knew there is no way that those charges are going to stick. Well, many, many years later, it took like 7 years later before they finally forced Curley and Schultz to plead guilty to a misdemeanor for which they thought they were not even going to go to prison.
You even told them not to plead.
Well, I didn't tell them beforehand because I didn't know them beforehand, but I had been publicly saying don't plead because part of what their plea was based on was this notion that they would be treated as normal people who had great records and just committed a misdemeanor and therefore would never go to prison. And I knew that was bullcrap because I knew this, as I say many times, we ain't in Kansas anymore, Toto. This story is the Wizard of Oz. This is Alice in Wonderland. And so I turned out to be right about that. And I got in a very big argument with Graham Spanier before his trial because he was put on trial for basically the same allegations that Curley and Schultz had originally been charged with, including what they eventually pled guilty to, the one misdemeanor. And I got the signal that his defense was going to be very, in my mind, wussified and
they were very passive,
right? Not nearly aggressive enough. Yeah. And I'm sure he remembers it to this day. I know I do because I went off on Graham on the phone in a way that I go off on people occasionally, but I don't think I've ever gone off on anyone worse. Maybe a couple customer service agents occasionally I might go off on more than I went off on Graham Spanier, but I went off on Graham Spanier in a way that I'm positive as a former very esteemed liberal university president he had never experienced in his adult life. And I told him he was going to get convicted, and I was right. And he got convicted of the same misdemeanor essentially as Curley and Schultz had pled guilty to. The next day after the conviction, the jury foreman publicly said, I think we made a mistake here. And part of the reason why his defense was so passive was because he had these high-priced lawyers who were looking at this case as if it was a normal case.
Right.
And in a normal case, they looked at this and go, wait a minute, there's no evidence against you. And oh, by the way, it seems pretty clear that the law that they're trying to convict you on didn't even exist at the time of the allegation. So there's nothing to worry about here. We're not going to even put you on the stand. We're not going to put on a defense. We're not going to question the one accuser that takes the stand, even though he's a complete and total fraud. And I had prepped them for that, and they did absolutely nothing. And so they took it, they did the high-priced lawyer thing. They relied on the facts and the law being on their side. They got screwed in the one jury conviction, which I knew the jury had to come back with something because otherwise they would be skewered themselves. Right. And then they ended up winning on appeal. They went all the way to federal court and won on appeal. It was tossed out. And then the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, a guy who's now the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, ends up going way out of his way. I'm sure this has never happened in the modern history of the country, where a state attorney general appeals a federal ruling that dismisses a misdemeanor from a person with a perfect record, to appeal that to make sure that he eventually ends up going to prison. And that's what happened, largely because he was running for governor. He was using it for political purposes. Yep. And then bizarrely, which tells you everything you need to know about the culture at Penn State and why this happened and why they were so vulnerable to this perfect storm, Graham, who's a great gentleman, a very nice guy, he and I have a good relationship now. And, I don't wish him any ill will, but we did an interview with him for the Death of Journalism podcast, which I now do twice weekly. And he acknowledged that he had actually voted for Josh Shapiro for governor because, as a good Democratic liberal, I guess he felt like he had to signal his virtue and show all of his friends what a good Democrat he is, because he couldn't possibly vote for the Republican who was a Trump guy running in Pennsylvania. So anyway, that's a long answer to the story here, but the administrators got totally railroaded because Sandusky did. This is a cascading effect of this whole case. And the cascade begins, let's be clear, the cascade begins with the railroading of Joe Paterno. Without Joe Paterno, there is no Jerry Sandusky scandal. It's because the news media was absolutely enthralled with this Greek tragedy of this 84-year-old legend who had just become the winningest coach in the history of college football.
Right.
Having it all come crashing down literally the week of his last home football game, which was to be broadcast live on ESPN against Nebraska. I mean, this literally was a Greek tragedy, and the media bought into it in 2 days with no facts, based on nothing but a grand jury presentment by a prosecution that was desperate to create a nuclear firestorm because they had a crappy case. That's everything about this whole case is the opposite of the perception. The perception was that when Sandusky and the administrators were charged, and that somehow the prosecution had this awesome case. No, they had a crap case, which is why they overcharged, why they went for the nuclear bomb, why after 2 days of not getting the media coverage they wanted, they went after Joe Paterno to pour some gasoline on the fire. That's what happened here. And because ESPN had nothing else going on that week and they made it a 24/7 moral panic story, a lot like COVID, everyone lost their damn minds. And all the incentives in this case were turned upside down. They became perverse, especially once Joe Paterno was fired, because once Joe Paterno was fired, then Penn State, and by the way, Grant Spanier was fired as well. Penn State and that board of trustees that made those decisions are now deeply, 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 deeply invested. They're as invested as Dr. Fauci is in the vaccines, okay? They are deeply invested in the idea that Jerry Sandusky must be guilty. Because can you imagine if it turns out after all that, oops, because you can't put that genie in the bottle, back in the bottle. You just fired the guy who put your university on the map. He's been there for 61 years. He's the winningest coach in the history of college football. You've destroyed this amazing moment that's supposed to be his last home game of his career. There's no way, there's no going back on that. So now everyone has to be guilty. So Penn State pays Louis Freeh, former FBI director, who is known for taking money for bogus investigations.
He's a whore. I mean,
he's a complete whore. He is a complete whore. And I don't say that lightly. No. Louis Freeh is a whore. He is. I mean, and it's not just on this case, but this case was probably his most well-known and dramatic, but there's been many other cases where he has just taken money to tell people what they want to hear. You pay him enough money, he's going to give you the investigation you want. And the Penn State Board of Trustees wanted the people they fired to be guilty. And of course, the media was too stupid to understand this. And I actually think it was partially too stupid, and also partially because they were very invested in Joe Paterno's guilt too, because the last thing they wanted, right? I think when the time the Louis Freeh report came out, which was almost a year, not quite a year after the whole story broke, I think that there were some media members who were starting to feel a little guilty about what they did to Paterno, and maybe a little worried that
your co-host Liz Habib, am I saying her last name right?
Yes, correct.
Liz Habib even told you that she was one of those people, because at the time that this story broke, Liz was a sports reporter, correct?
Sports anchor at the Fox affiliate in Los Angeles.
Yeah, a sports anchor. She was like, justice needs to be done. And
but right. But what I'm saying is that after the initial panic had worn off slightly, I think there was some anxiousness among the news media that maybe they had been too tough on Paterno, and they were thrilled when Louis Freeh came out and condemned Paterno. But they basically had their pom-poms out for Louis Freeh because he was giving them what they wanted, what they needed in order to have justified what they had done the previous November. of 2011. And the whole thing, it's really that Joe Paterno snowball that begins to go down the mountain that creates this avalanche.
Right.
And the avalanche really hasn't ended to this day. I mean, just yesterday, when we're recording this, Jerry Sandusky's defense team put out and filed in Pennsylvania court what should be a very newsmaking, explosive filing from a Dr. Barton, who's a very well-respected expert in numerous areas related to this case, where it's a 136-page filing that just completely destroys almost every aspect of the case against Jerry Sandusky, and it got almost no media coverage at all.
I didn't know about it until you sent me the link to your tweet about it just yesterday.
Right. Yeah, almost. I mean, I'm the only source that continues to cover this story effectively. And of course, even when occasionally a local outlet will cover it, they don't give it any context. And it's basically just put out on Facebook as another excuse for people who don't know anything about the case to comment on how guilty Jerry Sandusky is when they know absolutely nothing. And, Jerry's getting, old, and it's a miracle he's still alive now. I don't know how much longer he's going to stay alive. His sons seem to think he'll stay alive for a lot longer than even today. But who knows? I mean, heck, my good friend Franco Harris, who's been a warrior on this story, just passed away suddenly at the age of 72, just before
who was a massive star at Penn State as well as in the NFL.
Right, and
for people who don't know, and I don't know much about football, but he is the immaculate reception.
Immaculate reception.
Let me say that right.
Right. The immaculate reception. And unfortunately, he died 3 days before the 50th anniversary of the immaculate reception. And he and I had become very, very close because of my work on this case. And he was really the by far the biggest celebrity and the guy with the most to lose, who was willing to stand up for Joe Paterno.
Massively.
And he did so. And this will get us to the actual evidence in the case, which I'm sure people are wondering why I haven't talked about the evidence. The reason why Franco Harris was willing to take the risks that he did and to go stick his neck out on a limb for Joe Paterno had nothing to do with blind loyalty to his former college coach.
Right.
It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the fact that at Joe Paterno's funeral, Franco Harris, legend, absolute legend in the state of Pennsylvania. Everybody knows who Franco is, okay? And so Mike McQueary, who was the only witness in the entire case against Sandusky, the entire case, just one witness, Mike McQueary. It was then a former assistant. He lost his job when everybody else lost their job. But at the time of the scandal broke, he was assistant coach at Penn State University, had been there for many years. First as had quarterback there, then as a graduate assistant, then as an assistant coach. And he supposedly, in a year that was totally wrong, March 1st, 2002, he supposedly had witnessed Jerry Sandusky raping a boy in a shower. And that was the allegation that made all the headlines, and understandably so. People were outraged by that, sickened by that. How could that possibly happen? There was some question at the time of, well, wait a minute, this happened 10, 11 years ago, and Mike didn't beat the crap out of Sandusky when he saw him in the shower alone with a supposedly 10-year-old boy raping him? That didn't make sense to a lot of people, but the narrative the media gave was, well, he was just so stunned. He was so shocked that he just panicked and ran, even though this was a guy who had quarterbacked on national television and in front of 100,000 people at Beaver Stadium.
And was not a tiny guy.
Right. He was 6'4", 230 pounds, whatever he was. Anyway, so that was the only witness in the case. And that was the allegation. And that's all anybody was talking about when Joe Paterno dies 2 months after the scandal hits. And so they have his funeral, and Franco Harris comes up to Mike McQueary and says, mano a mano, man to man, eye to eye, Mike, what the heck happened? I'm paraphrasing here. I mean, Franco actually was working on his own podcast when he died. Thankfully, he was able to put together this exact story in part 3 of his podcast, which you can find at upon further review psu.com. That's upon further review psu.com. This is in part 3, where he talks in detail about having confronted Mike McQueary and asking him very, very specific, detailed questions about what he supposedly witnessed. And Franco Harris came away completely convinced that Mike McQueary had not witnessed anything. And I can tell you, I mean, it was so sad for me when Franco died, especially with the timing, but it was also very frustrating for me to hear, rightfully, everyone in the media talk about what a great man of character Franco Harris was, which he absolutely was. And yet no one is willing to then take the next step and go, okay, wait a minute. He's this amazing man of character and would never lie about anything. And here he is telling this very detailed story, which he has told numerous times to me on the record, and now putting it in his own podcast just before he dies. That ought to have power. That ought to have meaning. But of course, it doesn't fit the media's narrative. I've sent that podcast to some rather prominent people in the sports media, and they have definitely been impacted by it. But I don't think it's going to lead to anything because we don't live in that world. And so Franco's experience with Mike McQueary was very key. And let's be clear, it's not even close to the only piece of evidence that Mike McQueary did not see a rape.
Not at all.
It's the tip of the iceberg, but it's where we began. That is where we began. Like, wait a minute, Franco knows this didn't happen, and then Franco kind of led me down that path to investigate what really did happen with McQueary. And as I went down the path of what really did and did not happen with Mike McQueary, I came to the absolute certain conclusion that McQueary never saw anything close to a sexual assault. And without McQueary's sexual assault allegation, now there's no reason to believe any of the actual accusers. And so then you get each of these accusers, and one by one, they fall apart like a house of cards, because it was McQueary that kept the whole thing together. By the way, I guarantee you there's no one watching or listening to this right now who even remembers anything about this case other than Mike McQueary. Because
if they even remember him.
Right. But I mean, McQueary's the only thing you remember because the media never even bothered to go beyond that, because in their mind, well, we have a coach who witnessed a rape in a shower. Mm-hmm. Well, there's no need to go any further than that. And I can kind of understand that thinking if this had been a contemporaneous report where we knew, for instance, the exact date that it happened, but that's not the case. In fact, they got the date totally wrong. That March 1st, 2002 date I told you about, they had to admit was wrong. Totally wrong. This is not me making this up. This is not conjecture. This is not opinion.
This is on court record.
Yeah, the prosecution had to admit, oops, March 1st, 2002 was wrong. And the reason why they knew it was wrong, because they were given emails by Gary Schultz, one of the administrators who had been indicted. And they had found emails that proved that the actual date of the Mike McQueary, Joe Paterno meeting that was so infamous in all this was the morning of February 10th, 2001. So 13 months earlier. Right. And so then they decided, well, if the meeting is the morning of the 10th of February, 2001, that means Mike had to have witnessed this on February 9th, the night before, right? Because the only evidence they have that this is a rape is Mike's urgency to tell somebody. Now, why he doesn't tell the police is a great question. No one wants to ask or answer. But, he supposedly goes to see Joe Paterno the next morning. So it has to be February 9th, the night of February 9th. Well, there's so many problems with the night of February 9th, and I've kicked myself for many years for not fully investigating this sooner, because if I had, I think I could have made an impact here. But, it's probably my greatest discovery in this case, and it's the thing I regret the most, because the reality is it was very obvious and should have been obvious to the defense, who are a bunch of overwhelmed morons. But it was
Don't hold back, John. How do you really feel?
Well, it was very obvious that February 9th was never the date, because Mike McQueary had testified unequivocally at a preliminary hearing just after the story exploded that this was a very quiet night on campus. The prosecution even used that, very dramatically to try basically imply, because that they thought it was March 1st, 2002, which was also a Friday, but it was the Friday of the beginning of spring break at Penn State. And so their implication was, bum, 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 Jerry knows that the campus is going to be quiet and everyone will be gone and he'll have privacy at the Penn State showers where he can rape boys with no concern about being found out. Of course, there's all sorts of problems with that theory, but that was their right. theory. Well, the problem here is that February 9th of 2001 is not only a quiet night on campus, it's arguably the busiest night where Mike McQueary was of the whole year, because right across the street, there was a sold out rock concert going on. And within the building itself, there was a hockey game that was going on that started right at the time period when this supposedly occurred. There's absolutely no chance, none, that this occurred on February 9th. And you might say, well, what difference does that make? Well, it makes a massive difference. Not only does it mean they got the date wrong twice, but it also means that there's no chance that Mike went to go see Joe Paterno the morning after this occurred, which would be at least some level of urgency. So when did it happen? And I go in our first episode of With the Benefit of Hindsight, episode number 1. It's a little painstaking, but if you bear with it, I think it bears fruit.
It's
because
100% worth it.
Okay, so I'm glad to hear you say that, because if you bear with it, you're going to come to the same conclusion I did. I think you did, which is that the actual date this happened was December 29th, 2000, which means that Mike McQueary waited 6 weeks from the time he witnessed whatever he saw with Jerry Sandusky in a shower with a boy. We now know who the boy was. There was a 13-year-old who Jerry thought of as a son, who was on the record multiple times in both his words and his actions saying nothing had ever happened.
And who was it? Just throw the name.
His name is Alan Myers. His name is Alan Myers. He never testifies at Jerry Sandusky's trial. In my view, he did not want to put Jerry Sandusky in jail. He did not want to have blood on his hands. And the prosecution lied and tried to tell the jury that his identity was known only to God. That's a direct quote from the prosecutor, James McGettigan. Told the jury that that alone ought to be an appeal. In a rational world, right there, you've got an appeal of a conviction, because the prosecution knowingly lied to the jury and said the real identity of victim number 2, the boy in the McQueary episode, was known only to God. That was a lie. They knew who Alan Myers was. They just didn't like his story. They had interviewed him multiple times, and he told them to get lost. You're trying to get me to lie about Jerry Sandusky. He's the greatest thing that ever happened to me. He was on the record privately and publicly in numerous ways, both in his words and his actions, that made it abundantly clear he was never abused by Jerry Sandusky, and he remembered things that only the boy in the shower could possibly have remembered from that night. And the reality is that Mike McQueary waited 6 weeks between the time that this occurred and the time he goes to see Joe Paterno. And you're probably wondering, well, why would he suddenly go see Joe Paterno 6 weeks later? Well, we have a very good reason for that. Because while the so-called rape episode did not occur on February 9th, 2001, the day before he goes to see Joe Paterno, something else far more real and far more significant actually did occur on February 9th of 2001. Because February 9th, 2001 is the day that Mike McQueary reads in the local newspaper that the wide receiver coaching job at Penn State, the job he wanted badly, has just opened up because Kenny Jackson has left Penn State to go to work for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And so if you do the math on this and you understand what it's like to be a graduate assistant in college football, especially back in that era, and you also understand that year, college signing day, which was it's no longer a big day now because it's been so fragmented, but back in that era, college signing day was huge. Was November 7th that year. So he doesn't peg, if it had really been February 9th, Mike McQueary would have been exhausted. All he would have been thinking about was National Signing Day. it's effectively for a graduate assistant like this happening 2 days after the Super Bowl. You would remember when it happened. And he doesn't peg it to February 7th because it didn't happen on February 9th. What did happen on February 9th was he understood, oh my gosh, I got a shot at this job. So the next morning he calls Joe Paterno and decides I'm going to get some FaceTime with the coach and see if I can get this job.
And Joe Paterno famously says to him on the phone,
if this is about a job, Mike, don't bother coming over. I don't have one for you.
And
now,
that's a direct quote.
That was a quote according to Mike McQueary.
Right.
And see, and one of the, there have been so many fascinating things that have happened in my experience in the last 11 or 12 years, but this is maybe in the top 10 of things that have occurred through pure happenstance. So I'm in the Paterno home. I'm at the actual kitchen table where the conversation between Mike McQueary and Joe Paterno supposedly happened, although I don't believe it actually did happen there because Sue Paterno was there, and she has a very different description of what actually transpired.
Because Mike did show up at the Paterno home.
Yes, and Sue Paterno, who was there and has a legendary memory by all accounts. She describes it. We have an email to this effect. She describes that meeting, quote unquote meeting, as taking 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Now, there is zero chance in the world that Mike McQueary told Joe Paterno about a rape in a shower at Penn State
and walked out in 3 minutes.
And walked out in 3 minutes.
Hey, coach, just want to let you know what I saw. See you later. Have a good day.
Right. I mean, it's just absurd. It's just completely absurd. But so I'm in the Paterno family house with a whole bunch of people. There's like 10 people in this kitchen, and Sue Paterno is in the next, not in the table area, but she's off where the freezer is, I think literally getting some peachy Paterno ice cream. And I don't even know why I did this. I happened to reference Mike's testimony about if this is about a job, don't bother coming over. I don't have one for you. And she snapped around and screamed at me.
Yeah, she dressed you down.
That never happened. And I was like, okay, note to self, that never happened. And what was really amazing about that was I had never even thought much about that statement because at this time, I'm still presuming Jerry's guilty. Yep. I'm not even thinking about the fact that the date is wrong. I mean, I knew the date had been wrong once, but in fact, that was one of my biggest mistakes was I thought, there's no way the prosecution could be wrong twice about the date of something this important, but they were catastrophically wrong about it twice. And what I now believe happened, this is just my theory with regard to the job circumstance. I believe that this was all about a job for Mike and that Mike was worried about people figuring out that it was about a job or theorizing that it was about a job. And that's why he comes up with the lie that Joe Paterno told him that this is about a job, don't bother coming over. He's basically creating, he's reverse engineering his story. He needs to come up with a reason for why people would not believe or not figure out that this is about a job. Although I think he actually effectively worked in the opposite direction because the fact that he said that and the fact that Sue said to me that never happened. And I knew from everyone that Sue's memory was, is basically unimpeachable, and that she was there that day. It got me thinking about the job situation. And when you see that in the local newspaper, it's February 9th, that when it gets reported that the wide receiver coaching job is open. And just to be clear, for those that might not understand the way this coaching situation works, so he's a graduate assistant at the time. He's basically a nobody. I don't even think he has health insurance. He's getting paid nothing. He desperately needs a full-time job. He doesn't get that job. And so you're thinking, well, maybe he didn't want that job. Maybe that was just a coincidence. Zig.
He desperately wanted that job.
Well, here's how desperately he wanted it. He doesn't get it at the time of this supposed allegation against Sandusky, which kills the cover-up theory. Kills it because the first thing that happens in a cover-up there is Joe Paterno says to Mike, wow, okay, Mike, thanks so much for bringing this to our attention.
Would
Please
you like
keep
a
it to your-
job?
Yeah, please keep this to yourself, and congratulations, you're our new wide receivers coach.
Right.
None of that happens. But then the job opens up again 3 years later. And guess who gets the job?
Right.
Mike McQueary gets the job.
I
3 years later. The meeting between Paterno and McQueary was at least in part, if not primarily, motivated by a job. And we get into great detail about how and why that is. And the evidence that I'm right about the date is far more voluminous than I'm able to give you in the time we have allotted. And it includes, by the way, some of the prosecution's own witnesses and their testimony being far more consistent with my timeline than with their own timeline.
I don't want to take away from what happened with McQueary. Am I saying it? Is it McQueary? Yeah, McQueary.
Mike McQueary.
Yeah, I don't want to take away from him because he started this whole, to excuse the sports metaphor, he started the ball rolling.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one accuser who ends up being the penultimate driving force in this, and that's Aaron Fisher.
Well, to get the timeline right, and the timeline is so important.
So important, yeah.
Because people think, I really do believe that the average perception of people is that, like, in one day or maybe in a week's period of time, 10 boys came forward to say that they were assaulted by Jerry Sandusky. Right? I think that's probably the perception. And that's totally false. First of all, there were no boys. Everybody who testified at Jerry Sandusky's trial was an adult, including victim number one. And victim number one happens before Mike McQueary. But Mike McQueary, see, all of these allegations.
Allegedly at this point.
Right. All these allegations help to bolster each other, which legally I think is so dangerous.
Yep.
Because, to me, every allegation ought to have to stand on its own. And none of these allegations could even stand for a second on their own. But because of McQueary, that was when everyone started to believe Aaron Fisher. So they have Aaron Fisher for 2 years with no corroboration at all sorts of problems with his story. The story continues to change. The timeline continues to change. The details continue to change. He can't even testify at the grand jury. He twice breaks down without being able to answer questions. He finally reads a statement to the grand jury. By the way, that grand jury does not indict Jerry Sandusky. Think about how ineffective Aaron Fisher's original testimony must have been. The grand jury hears from him 3 times and does not even indict him.
3 times, folks.
Does not even indict Jerry Sandusky because they don't believe him, and he's all the prosecution has. Mm-hmm. Then Mike McQueary falls in their lap with this 10-year-old story, and now here's what they can do, and this is the key to the whole case. They now have basically the hook and the bait, McQueary and Fisher. And they can go fishing into this pond of former Second Mile, that was Jerry Sandusky's charity, former Second Mile kids, a charity for at-risk kids. They're now all adults. And let's be clear who these guys are, all right? They are from broken homes where there's drug use. There's probably real sexual abuse, real physical abuse. They've probably got broken marriages. They've got probably job problems, money problems. This is a very, very bad pool. Obviously not all of them are like this, but this is a pool where you're getting
a preponderance of them are. They're all
preponderance. Right.
Every single one of them is a Second Mile kid.
Right. So they have the names and the phone numbers and the addresses of all these former Second Mile kids, and they can go fishing. And what they do is then they do hundreds of interviews where they say, we've got this witness, football coach. He's told us he saw a rape of a young boy. We've got this allegation. I don't know if they used Aaron Fisher's name, but, we've got victim number one who says he was abused for 2 or 3 years. Did anything happen to you? And of those hundreds and hundreds of interviews, almost nobody says yes. Almost nobody. You could argue, I would say that at the time of the arrest, there's basically 4 or 5 people who actually have said, yes, something similar happened to me. And why did those 4 or 5 go for this? Well, I would argue, and the evidence I think backs me up, that these were the ones that were able to figure out where this might be going. That that basically what happened here is, well, this didn't happen to me. Doesn't sound like Jerry, but if it is Jerry, and I was friends with Jerry, and boy, Penn State and Second Mile, and Jerry's got to have some money. I mean, there's got to be something good might happen here, and that's not just theory, because the key allegation that backs up Aaron Fisher is from so-called victim number 4, and he makes his allegation with a plaintiff's attorney with him in his interview with investigators. And the plaintiff's attorney isn't just there sitting on his hands. The plaintiff's attorney is key to how and why the allegation finally becomes sexual in the way that investigators want. And it's all on tape. They thought they had turned the recorder off. They accidentally did not return the recorder off. It was all played in court. It should have been a smoking gun as to how the sausage was made with regard to these allegations. And instead, the media thought it was just funny that they hadn't, actually returned the recorder off. And this was embarrassing for the investigators. The judge even told the jury, don't let this impact your view of the allegation, but only of the investigators themselves, which again, to me, that's another appeal issue right there. How in the world can you not? Because basically what happened was the plaintiff's attorney said to the investigators, can I talk to you away from my client? And said, hey, can we lie to him and tell him we got a lot more evidence than we actually have to get him to start talking? And the investigators say, yeah, sure. We do that all the time. I'm paraphrasing, but that's a pretty close paraphrase.
It's not untrue.
And then all of a sudden he starts talking. And by the way, victim number 4 made many millions of dollars, and victim number 4's attorney made many millions of dollars because he represented multiple victims in this particular case. And oh, by the way, by the time the trial comes around, victim number 4's therapist and Aaron Fisher's therapist are the same guy.
Same therapist.
Same person.
Yep.
And I don't think that's a coincidence at all. And that guy's a complete quack. Complete quack.
So I know we have a limited amount of time, and I don't want to steal the thunder of your entire production with the benefit of hindsight. What would you say to the people? Because I think you're a kind of a born Pennsylvania native. You're a California resident now, and you've been out there for quite some time. But people would say, "Well, you're obviously a Penn State fan. You're a paternal fan. So you're digging into this because you want to defend Penn State, and you want to defend Paterno, and you want to defend Sandusky because you're just this hardcore person, and you obviously went to college there." And I know what the answer to that is, but for my viewers, what's the truth of that? And then I want to ask you a couple of other things related to the personal impact on you.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So here's the answer on that, and it could not be more hilariously wrong.
You've heard that before, though, right?
Oh yeah. No, to this day on Twitter, people always assume that I'm a Penn State fan or graduate or something. And here's the facts. While I grew up in Pennsylvania, I was a huge Notre Dame football fan. I would root very hard.
They must have kicked you out of Penn State for that, or out of Pennsylvania for that.
Well, right, I went to Georgetown University, which barely even had a Division III football team at the time. I went to a couple of Penn State games in Philadelphia when they played Temple. I would root for Temple. That's true. I respected Paterno. I was rooting for them against Miami in the 1986 national championship game. And I was, so I was happy that when Penn State would do well, but I was no fan. But I can tell you now, I have very few stronger rooting interests in sports than rooting against everything that happens at Penn State. I root against Penn State football with a great passion. I hate Penn State. I loathe the institution of Penn State as much as I basically look at them as Dr. Fauci. I mean, that's the level of hatred I have.
I've got a couple of supporters watching right now that are applauding you, and you don't even know it because of what you just said. So
I mean that seriously. That's how it's the best analogy that I can come up with. I hate Penn State with enormous. Now that Franco Harris, it's only positive of Franco Harris dying. I no longer have any fear of disparaging Penn State and Penn State fans, because I was always a little hesitant because I knew Franco would get irritated by that. But no, I 90% of Penn State fans have proven themselves to be complete wussies, morons, virtue signaling a-holes. They should be worshiping the ground that I walk on. And instead, to this day, most of them, not all, there's been some very good people from Penn State, but it's a minority. I don't know what the percentage is. It might be 10%. It might be more than that. I think the number is growing, because I do think that there have been a lot of converts, partially because of our podcast with the benefit of hindsight. But I have great disdain for Penn State as an institution, the football program, the Paterno family I despise. Scott Paterno, who is Joe Paterno's son and lawyer on this, is one of the people I hate most in the entire world.
He basically threw his dad under the bus.
I believe almost all of this is Scott Paterno's fault, either directly or indirectly, and that's I believe, and that's why I hate him. It's not why I came to that conclusion, but also I hate him because of the way he's treated me personally. He's an asshole. He's a bad human being. He's a moron. He was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple. He is.
I've never heard that analogy. That's awesome.
He is just a terrible human being, and he is largely to blame for all of this, either directly or indirectly. I have disdain for his brother Jay, who's a coward, who knows Jerry Sandusky is innocent, but in fact was the first credible person to tell me effectively that he thought that Jerry was innocent. That was back in Labor Day weekend when we spent 3.5 hours together in his living room in 2012. But he will never say that publicly. He's a member of the Penn State Board of Trustees now. So I can't stand Penn State. When people say that, they're just looking for a reason to discredit me, because unfortunately, by the way, that allegation tells you an awful lot about how and why the story went down the way that it did, because Penn Staters should have been the ones fighting for their university's reputation, but in the vast majority of cases, it was the opposite, because Penn Staters felt like they had to signal their virtue. Yep. It was again, just like COVID, they had to wear their masks and signal their virtue and self-flagellate, because they didn't want the rest of the world thinking that they had enabled child sex abuse on their vaunted football team. And so Penn Staters are actually the worst of my, I don't even know what you would call it, fan base, clientele, listenership, whatever. It's not Penn Staters I'm trying to appeal to. I have so much disdain for Penn Staters in general that I've long ago stopped trying to convince them. It's the rest of the world that's actually far more convincible, because ironically, because Penn Staters went through so much trauma, again, it's kind of like the vaccines. Because, if you've taken the vaccine, you don't want to think about the idea that maybe you did something stupid, right? And you went through this for nothing. Well, similarly, although in many ways different, Penn Staters don't want to acknowledge that they went through all that trauma for nothing, and they threw 5 great men under the bus because they crapped their pants in the middle of
they had a riot on campus.
It wasn't really a riot. That was more of a media contrived.
Okay.
I don't know what you would call it, but I mean, there were people there that was actually who told me, multiple people told me that the news media was actually egging students on, because they weren't creating any damage in the so-called riot that occurred when Joe Paterno was fired. So that was, there was a news van that was overturned, which I applauded. That was the last sighting of a testicle at Penn State University, was when the students turned over a news van. But after that moment, all testicles were banned at Penn State ever
Which,
since November 2011.
for those of you that choose to in which I cannot recommend enough, because this is so important to the entirety of the conversation, which even leads to your subsequent podcast with Liz, the death of journalism. There's a tie-in to no testicles being allowed on Penn State campus to Jerry Sandusky.
Well, no, that's exactly right. I didn't mean to use it that way, although it did occur to me when I did. Yeah, we now have Jerry Sandusky's medical records.
Right.
And it's very, very clear to anybody who's remotely objective that at least for the last couple of most important allegations, specifically victims number 1 and victim number 9, who was the most hellacious, horrendous, raping in the basement, screaming, bloody underwear, the whole bit. Those two allegations occurred in the 2006-2009 realm. And during that time, there's absolutely positively no way that Jerry Sandusky could have performed those acts. And if he had, both of those victims would have testified based upon their allegations. They would have testified that, oh, by the way, it was very weird because Jerry Sandusky had no testicles. And that's literally part of his physical medical records. He had virtually no testicular matter. That is a direct quote from his medical records well before he was ever arrested, indicted, anything like this. Not as if the doctor was trying to come up with some excuse for Jerry's innocence. This couldn't be more clear cut. And there's just no way, if you read the allegations from at least those two, and I'm trying to be as generous as possible, because we only have the records, that say that from that time period. But my guess is this has been a lifelong situation for Jerry Sandusky. There's no possible way that, given these allegations, that no one would have ever testified and said, yeah, by the way, as I'm trying to prove my allegation that's worth millions and millions of dollars, I might want to mention that Jerry had this weird deformity where he has no testicles. No one ever did that. No one did that at trial. No one did that in the settlement documents, which we have had leaked to us for the 36 guys that got paid well over $100 million with no vetting from Penn State. So there's just no, as partially, I would know Jerry was innocent without the medical records, but the medical records really are just the final nail in the coffin.
So John, you've invested, like, from, what year did you start? Just real quick.
Well, I started on this case immediately in November of 2011.
So we're at 12 years now.
Yeah, over 12 years. Well, almost 12 years.
Almost 12 years now that you've been invested in this. And this has been at great cost to you, which is one of the, and I told you just a smidgen of my own story as far as personal investment when you start to dig into things, but that's one of the reasons why this story has been very interesting to me is the reality that the criminal justice system is I don't even want to say broken, because that's almost a pass. It's an utter failure, but it's also failing individuals who shouldn't even be involved in the sense of being involved in the criminal justice system. But it went so far as to, if this has cost you dearly on a criminal level, because you were arrested and had to fight criminal charges for your actions involved in investigating this entire story. Is that's correct? Is that a fair?
Yeah. And as strange as the last 12 years have been, well, that episode was horrendous, and it was horrendous and absurd and outrageous. And
it was a miscarriage of justice.
In any other case, I would have had a multi-million-dollar lawsuit on my hands. Mm-hmm. I'm not even sure that's the worst thing that's happened in the last 12 years, but it was right up there. I mean, you're referring to the fact that I went to a speech. I flew across the country to go to a speech in the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania area of Matt Sandusky, the former adopted son of Jerry and Dottie Sandusky, who claimed to be a victim right in the middle of the trial because he knew that his adopted dad was going down, and he needed to a life raft. He needed some way to make money because his name was now going to be mud after being having been gold for his entire adopted life. He actually had requested that Jerry and Dottie Sandusky adopt him as a late teenager. So, I mean,
Wasn't he 18?
yeah, I mean, it's just so it's well after any alleged abuse would have occurred, but his story of abuse has changed more often than I think anyone else in the case. His adopted siblings know he's lying. He tried to get one of them to go ahead and lie with him. I mean, he's an obvious fraud. He fought his ex-wife in court while Jerry was on house arrest to try to get his children to be able to visit Jerry Sandusky. This was well after the firestorm started. Anyway, I went to this event with a ticket, public event, at a public school, with a ticket in my own name. And there were police there waiting for me. They warned me about behaving. They told me where I could sit and not sit. They moved my seat once. I went ahead and did what they wanted. I didn't cause any problem. I was just literally sitting in my seat. And what effectively happened, I now know, having put all the pieces together, was that Matt Sandusky was terrified of doing this speech while I was in the audience. And I think he refused to come out because the thing was like 15, 20 minutes late in starting, which there was no reason for it to be 15 or 20 minutes late in starting. We're in a school auditorium and it's one person. He's not, he's not Elvis Presley or Michael Jackson, waiting, getting the crowd all hyped up. And I was just sitting there. And by the way, they prevented any videotaping or audio recording of this event, which makes no sense if you're a victim of sex abuse that you're trying to spread your message about this. So they banned all recording because of me. And thankfully, surreptitiously, there was some video of what happened to me, which was that I was pulled out of my chair by police. I was very roughly handled, yanked out of my chair, dragged across the floor, taken outside to a side room. I was handcuffed very, very roughly. I had bruises and scrapes all over my wrists. I was,
but you fought them, John. You were trying to beat them all up and threatening their lives, so they had to do it.
Yeah, I don't think that's even close to what happened. I was in such shock that I was just doing the ragdoll thing, and I was pretty messed up. And then bizarrely they took me behind the stage where they literally took me right to where Matt Sandusky was standing, which I thought
you
was
had some choice things to say to Matt at that time.
Yes, I did. And I thought the whole thing was hilarious. But I was then arraigned after spending several hours chained to a chair with no access to my phone or anything. Where I was arraigned that night facing I think it was 19 years. That number seems to ring a bell. 19 years in prison if I was convicted on all these bogus charges. And
could they charge you? What was it? Resisting with force?
Oh yeah, they were all sorts of things. I mean, trespassing on a school, and I mean, it was all completely bogus. But it
was contrived.
Oh, beyond that, it was. But what was so terrible about it was I live in California, and I mean, there aren't too many places in the United States more difficult to get to than Bethlehem, Pennsylvania from Southern California. And they knew this, right? So they knew that, me coming back for a hearing and, if I'm coming all the way there, they basically have me by the balls because I'm going to take almost any plea deal to make this go away because I don't want to have to come back again, right? So, and I had a terrible lawyer who was a local. By the way, my advice in these situations is never get a local lawyer when you're not local, because in a case like this, they're beholden to your enemies. Long story short, I basically pled it down to what was essentially a parking ticket for disturbing the peace. And that was, I paid a small fine and that was it. But it was a massive aggravation. It cost me at least $5,000 in legal fees and probably more than that when you consider.
You're lucky
travel.
you're lucky you didn't end up sitting in the Hooskow with Curly and
Well, that actually would have been interesting, but anyway, the whole point is this is the nature of this case, how upside down it is. I should have been a hero in that case. I mean, can you imagine?
As a journalist in this situation, every media outlet in the world should have covered this and said, look at the suppression of speech. Look at the suppression of the press here. And that never happened for you, did it?
Oh God, no, and not at all. And I mean, no, not even close. And the only coverage that there was, I think I was referred to as a Sandusky fan, not as a journalist. Because I don't think they didn't want to admit that this was had a journalistic aspect to it. And so anyway, the media
and just so people understand, you're a college, you went to college for journalism.
Well, no, I did not. I did not go to college for journalism, but I have certainly been a journalist for a very long time. I studied government at Georgetown.
Oh, there you go.
I've been a TV sportscaster. I've been a radio talk show host. I've been an Emmy-winning talk show host and analyst and commentator. I've been a radio talk show host, a documentary filmmaker, award-winning documentary filmmaker, a podcaster, and a senior columnist at Mediaite for a very, very long time.
Right. So your credentials as a recognized member of the
if they had wanted to make me a journalistic hero, they easily could have done that. And if I was fighting for a cause they, meaning the media, news media, believed in, they absolutely would have done that. But this was not a cause that they wanted to support, so they just pretended it didn't happen. And and it was a horrendous experience, but it was edifying as far as.
I lost your sound. Did you unplug yourself? Uh-oh. What did we have happen there? There we go. I don't know what happened. I lost you for a second, and then.
All right. Well, anyway, I learned from that whole situation that the media is completely and totally fundamentally broken, which is part of why I have my current podcast, which is The Death of Journalism.
I don't know what happened. Sorry about that. Thank you for carrying on. This has cost you too on a personal level. Obviously $5,000 some in legal defense and all of that, but you've taken some hits on a personal level in that people have, if I'm understanding some of what you said throughout your podcast, people have distanced themselves from you in some respects on this.
Oh, well, no, this whole thing is, I've had a lot of bad experiences in my life, but this has been by far the worst. Who knows how many opportunities I've lost because of this. My career.
You're only 25 and look at you. So
I was a young man when this story started. When Facebook puts forward, pictures from at the beginning of this case, my wife looks at me and goes, "Man, you are old," and she's right. Because when this case started, I was a young man. Now I'm an old man. It sucked the life out of me. It's destroyed my career. It's made me oftentimes not want to continue to go on in any way.
As far as in the media and whatnot.
It sucked a lot of my desire to live at times. I really I have an enormous amount of anger and resentment over how this whole thing has gone down, and then specifically how I have been treated in it. There's the list of people that I would love to see ill happen to is far too long to get into even in an hour and a half long interview. It's been terrible. And it's not a situation that it's really realistic for me to recover from. And I don't even, and the weirdest part of the whole thing is I don't even like many of the people I'm defending. Like I said, I hate the Paterno family. I hate Penn State. I hate Dottie Sandusky, who I went on the Today Show with in a second Today Show interview. I don't really like Jerry that much. There's very few people now that Franco's dead. There's nobody in the story I really like a lot.
You just recently reinvigorated to some degree your relationship with Graham Spanier, who was the president of the entire Penn State University system.
we have a working relationship. I mean, he called
You're
me.
diametrically opposed philosophically.
Oh yeah, no, he's very liberal and I'm very conservative. But he was nice enough to call me when Franco Harris died. He was the only one of the inner group of Penn Staters that did that. So I think that was pretty telling. But no, I had a very dim view of human beings before this story, and now I have a view. I have a view of human beings that is as dark as I think is humanly possible to have and still be standing.
You said something throughout the course, and this is more towards the end, obviously, because as you started the show with Liz, COVID had not come on the scene yet, and it was through the course of it that all of this sprang up. And you said that with the rise of cancel culture and the rise of the media industrial complex and whatnot, you saw that the response from both the nation, the people, and the state, in the grand scheme of things, the state and the media was all telegraphed by how the Penn State story and the Jerry Sandusky story played out. And you said, looking at it, you could have predicted how everyone was going to respond to COVID.
I did predict it. I
right.
did.
Which you and I share that, because I had been telling people for years something big is coming. Now I couldn't have put a name on it.
No, I didn't say I predicted COVID. I predicted very, very early on how this was all going to go down. And I was pretty darn right on almost everything. It was largely because of my Penn State experience, because as I've already said, even though the stories are obviously very, very different, at their core, they share a lot of similarities. A moral panic where the media immediately gets invested in a nonsensical narrative, and then the leaders get invested, and it snowballs down the mountain and creates an avalanche, and it's not reversible. And that's effectively what happened in both of those two stories. Except COVID is real. Jerry Sandusky's sex abuse was not. That's the most important distinction between the two.
Do you see this as a I want to say this. Do you see that what has played out from Penn State until now as almost a natural progression in the media, especially, but also in the collusion between media and the state, as being like this was a foregone conclusion, because they all work so hand in hand. In fact, Sarah Ganem, who was the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, thanks for turning me on to that podcast, by the way. That's a train wreck and a half. Do you see this as something that was bound to happen, or is going to continue to happen because no one's learned their lessons from this?
Well, I think we've seen smaller versions of Penn State I think Penn State really was the first massive story in the modern era of its kind. It wasn't the first in the history of the country by far.
Mm-mm.
I mean, I still don't know. This is a whole nother story, but I think that the closest I can come up with is the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case. I mean, I think there's some similarities between the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case and the Sandusky case. There's similar moral panic, similar massive media coverage, similar, potential. I'm not sure whether, Bruno Hauptmann was guilty or partially guilty or whatever, but I do know that his trial was a complete joke from a due process standpoint. And so anyway, but in the modern realm, in this modern era, I think Penn State really did pave a new path and showed us a lot of what can happen. But the media has blown so many stories subsequent to this. I mean, Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, Manti Te'o, and his dead girlfriend, Jussie Smollett, the Covington Catholic kids. There's so many. I mean, my
Kyle
God,
Rittenhouse.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's so many elements of COVID that fit into that. There was so many news stories that turn out to be fake. The Duke, and not just Duke lacrosse, but Duke volleyball with BYU, which was the subject of our first episode of The Death of Journalism. I think that was on a minor level, had similarities to a situation where the media buys into a obviously false narrative and can't let go. I mean, this is happening on a fairly regular basis, and I'm sure I'm leaving out a few. I mean, Russiagate. While I'm anti-Trump, I do think the media blew it largely on Russiagate. So there. In fact, I would argue that the bigger the story, the better chance it is that the news media will blow it. And that's it is almost a universal truth. The bigger the story, the better chance that they will blow it, and the better chance they will blow it very, very badly, because the incentive structure gets all screwed up, and because the reality is that the media is just so broken that the more pressure that is on the media, the bigger the story, the more the pressure, the better chance of those pressure points bursting. And that's what's happened time and time again.
Do you think that there's going to be any chance? Well, I guess that's probably the wrong way of saying it. What is it going to take for media to salvage its ability to go back to the days of actual hard-hitting journalism?
I don't think there's any chance of that. And because I think that the genie of social media is out of the bottle. And I think that now everything is so fragmented, and that now all the incentives are to provide consumers with what they want to hear and to create a good story that sells. It's basically the movie business now. It's, give me a narrative that makes me feel good, or that I want to hear, or give me a good story. Facts be damned, truth be damned, logic be damned, impact be damned. And so I don't think there's any going back now. For a while, I thought, well, if we have a massive economic downturn and a lot of these entities go under and we kind of rebuild, is there a chance of that? But nah, that was a fantasy. And partially because of social media, and partially, just because this younger generation, my God, as bad as journalism is now, it's going to get so much worse, because this younger generation doesn't have a freaking clue. I mean, they think journalism is virtue signaling. That's what they think it is. That the job of a journalist is to pick the virtuous side, signal the virtue, which is almost always the liberal or woke side, and to do justice in that way. They believe in that entire concept of wokeness. I mean, the idea that what's popular is inherently good is the way that they are taught to do, quote unquote, I don't even call it journalism. They do media. It's all popularity. Popularity is the coin of the realm, not truth. And once you're in that world where popularity is the coin of the realm, where, on Twitter, you can see how many retweets and likes and views a tweet has or a YouTube video has, then you're done, because it's inherently antithetical to journalism. Journalism isn't about popularity. It's about truth. Truth means nothing now. In fact, the truth oftentimes is at a massive disadvantage.
Yeah, it gets in the way of itself almost.
Well, the old line that's been attributed to lots of different people, like Churchill. I don't know if Churchill ever actually said it, but a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. I mean,
yep.
that's way worse now. I mean, because an unpopular truth, like as I've experienced in the Penn State story, and I don't understand why my truth is unpopular, but I do understand that it is, as I tried to explain at the beginning of our interview. And the reality is that an unpopular truth has no chance. None. You have no chance. It's always going to be the popular lie that will always win. And so anyway,
it almost gives hope to some degree to people like you who are really doing the more independent thing now, obviously, because the mainstream or legacy media doesn't want anything to do with you. I mean, you've developed a good relationship with can't remember his name now, from NBC.
Bob Costas?
No, you had Bob Costas who and then you were on
Matt Lauer,
yeah, who's now also experienced a little bit of the very thing that he was part of. But you've developed some of that. But for the most part, the legacy media is kind of been abandoned by critical thinkers. And what you're seeing is a rise of independent journalistic endeavors from, like Epoch Times and whatnot.
It's not helping me at all, because I mean I'm it's ruined me financially, and I can't, it's hard for me to get any traction getting the word out. I just tell the truth as I see it. I'm there as a resource for people who actually care about the truth and seek it out. The podcast, with the benefit of hindsight, has been far more popular than I thought it would be, and far more well received than even I hoped it would be. So I'm proud about that, and Mike Agavino deserves a lot of credit for funding and producing that, our producer. But the reality is that I wish I had never got involved in any of this, because my life would be a heck of a lot better today if I had not. And that's pretty much a sad testament to the state of journalism, because we should be living in a world where, I'm not saying that, there should be statues of me or parades, but
those would just get torn down later on anyway.
but I ought to at least have a career.
Right.
Because I'm doing,
because you had a credible career before this.
Right. And I did my best work on this story, and it's done nothing but harm me. But that's the world we live in 2023.
Well, you caught my attention. That should be enough of a reward.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time.
We went a little longer than what I thought we would, having you on, and I know you got family and life, and and I've kept you this long. Where would you have people look besides Framing Paterno, which is up for people to watch for free? And that's the other thing, people. It's not behind a paywall. If you want to hear just the Paterno side of this, you can go to framingpaterno.com and watch this. But there's also, you've got 2 podcasts. Is there anything else? And give your shout outs there.
If you're on Twitter, my Twitter feed it's a poor Twitter handle, but it's memorable.
It's hilarious, by the way.
It's Zigman Freud, Zigman, Zigman Freud, which is an old college golf team nickname of mine. So I should never have used that, but when I picked it 11, 12 years ago, I did not think that I'd be spending all my day on Twitter, which is what I do. So that's
he does, by the way, I've noticed.
But you that's probably the place where you can find most of my commentary. You can find all the podcast episodes there, and any commentary I have on any given subject of the moment.
Anything going on in the mix right now for you, John?
As far as
you working on any other projects?
Well, I mean, the death of journalism is taking,
right.
We do that twice a week. So that's a lot of time and effort on that. So
is that getting a lot of traction?
I don't know. Depends on who you ask.
Journalists don't like it, but
yeah, that's true. It's good stuff. I can tell you that. People ought to be listening to it.
Oh, I 100% agree. Is Liz still teaching at the college?
No, Liz unfortunately is no longer doing the podcast with me because she lives in 3 different cities, and our platform really wasn't working that well technically with remote broadcasts. And since we never knew where she was going to be, and we had a very short window to hit, we all just decided that we probably should go in another direction. And so I may be continuing the Death of Journalism by myself. I may be doing it with a new co-host. We don't know. Who the heck knows? It's
a great show, by the way. It says so much of what so many people who are in our camp understand. So if I would point people personally, I would point people first to with the benefit of hindsight, and then let that bleed into and lead into the Death of Journalism, because I think they're interlaced.
Sounds good to me.
So so you're working on that and playing golf on occasion.
Well, we've had so much rain here in California. I haven't played much golf recently, but I might be giving up golf too.
You're welcome to come and play golf in Minnesota in January and February if you'd like. So
I'm almost 56 years old, so I'm basically shutting everything down at this point. Shutting down my career, shutting down my golf game. It's all coming to an end here rather shortly. But
well, if you ever get any more news or information that comes out on this, or if you find out any breaking news on Sandusky, you let us know and we'll definitely cover it. And I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason that this story has been so important to me is because I have seen so much of what took place at Penn State and with the Jerry Sandusky story interlaced with my own. And many of you who have been watching for a while, I got Skipper watching, Sarah's watching, Dana was watching earlier. For those of you who are watching in replay, when I launched this channel, it was because I was in pursuit of justice. I was in pursuit of what is right. And that's what I saw with John when I heard him on Tom Wood's show. And what made me listen was there's this desire for justice. There's a desire for what's right. And we hear so much talk about social justice. We hear so much talk about reparations and things like that. But we don't ever really hear much talk about just pure justice. When an injustice is done, and this is a quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but when injustice is done to one person, it's an injustice to all of us. What was done to Jerry Sandusky ultimately was done to every single one of us. What was done to Joe Paterno and Graham Spanier and Curly Schultz, if I'm remembering his name right. All of those things, they're injustices done in the name of virtue signaling and cancel culture and all of this. It's all done to all of you, any of you who are watching. If you formed an opinion about Jerry Sandusky, if you formed an opinion about Joe Paterno, if you formed an opinion about what happened at Penn State without the facts, because the media said Jerry Sandusky is a child raping predator, if what happened to Jerry Sandusky's accusers, to the alleged victims, was enough for you to be outraged, hey, John, it's good to see you, man. If all of that was enough for you to go, Jerry Sandusky should be taken out and he should be drawn and quartered and flogged and all of that, and you knew none of the facts, you are as guilty as the rest of the country was during COOF. You are as guilty as everyone else ever for rushing to a conclusion and for drawing a conclusion before the facts are in. And when I heard that Jerry Sandusky was accused of child molestation, I was like, no one would lie about that. Well, you go watch with the benefit of hindsight. John, uh, for those of you who don't know, John Delarose, phenomenal show, by the way. And I would encourage you guys to go and watch his stuff. Check out his graphics, his graphic novels. And I'm not talking cartoons. I'm not talking about comic books. John does excellent work. And John, you should reach out to John Ziegler, because he would be a phenomenal guest for your platform. Your show is not for everyone. It's for everyone that matters, John. But if any of you were at that point where you're like, oh, child molestation, it's horrible. And it is. It's horrible. Jerry Sandusky is guilty because he molested children. I guarantee you don't know all the facts. I guarantee you, you do not know the stories, the reality. Millions and millions and millions of dollars were paid out to people who had no connection to Jerry Sandusky. They just claimed they were. They were never vetted. They were never shown to be actual victims. Some of them, I'm not even kidding you, can prove they ever met Jerry Sandusky. Period. But all of us are like, child molesters should rot in hell. They should be executed. They should never be let out. And if they're convicted and there's proof, I agree. But in the case of Jerry Sandusky, in the case of the cover-up, these individuals who were administrators at Penn State, Coach Paterno, Joe Paterno, winningest coach in the history of college football, career was destroyed and died a few months later, a broken and ruined man after false accusations. Because two people, Mike McQueary and Aaron Fisher, lied. And the reason that all of that matters to me is that people lied about me. And it took that happening to me to realize it could happen to anybody. Do you understand? And if the last 3 years have not woken you up, made you woke, but awakened you to the fact that that monstrous machine can be turned on you, and John can speak to this because it's happened to him with some of his platform. People have tried to turn on him and made false accusations about him. If that can happen to big names, how much more can it happen to people who are like me, who are no ones in the grand scheme of things? Because it did happen to me. So I would encourage all of you to go and watch Framing Paterno. I would encourage you to listen to With the Benefit of Hindsight. I would encourage you to listen to The Death of Journalism. And if it takes sharing this out, which I would love for you guys to do, share this out. Put this out. Go look up John Ziegler. Go find out what he's done. Go find out the people who are listening to him. Franco Harris. I put the name of Franco Harris, who just passed away not that long ago. I put the name of his podcast up here earlier that he put out, which was, I can't remember it right now. Like solid people. We need facts, and we need to reserve judgment. And the media, the legacy media, needs to refrain from making judgments, needs to refrain from making commentary on things that we don't have all the facts on. Neutrality in the media drives cultural response. And we need to slay that giant, is what we need to do. You need to slay that giant. It needs to die. And we can do that together. And so I would ask you to share this on whatever platforms, social media platforms you use. Share this to point people to it, to what John Ziegler has done. Because as you've heard, he was arrested and abused. He's lost his career. He's lost friends. He's lost relationships. And so many of us can relate to that. So share this. Point people to John Ziegler's podcasts. Get people to listen and make them ask questions about how they form opinions about things just because the media says it. Because if we look back over the last 3 years, it's happened over and over and over and over again. So many people buy into a legacy media narrative thinking it's good for them. We have to trust them. They're the media. They wouldn't lie to us. The state would never lie to us. The media would never lie to us. Well, there have been people out there like me and John and others, John, who tell people, no, they will lie to you. They will, because their goal is the same. The state's goal and the media's goal is the same because they work hand in hand to fool you and make you subservient to the agenda. So I'm going to wrap this up just so one more time. And well, I don't know if John, if you're still watching, John Delarose, if you're still watching, thank you so much for everything you've done for me in the last year, because you helped push me up in the algorithm when we connected. And that's one of the reasons I'm still on YouTube, is because of the work that you did promoting me and with your fan base. So I can never thank you enough for that, brother. I've got the merch, folks, mugs, tumblers. I love these shot glasses, by the way. Leather. I got my coffee. I have these beanies. Got a couple people watching that have had them. So I've got these beanies available now. So I don't know if you guys can see that. And love this color too. Looks good on some people. Doesn't necessarily look all that good on me. No, John, you did a lot, because you really did push me up. You really brought you and Carrie especially, and Carter too. Buy the merchandise right now. I've got the fundraiser going on for my friend and co-host of Behind the Curtain over on Rumble, which is a part of this platform, but it's a Rumble exclusive. For Dana, for her legal defense fund, going after the people who killed her mom. And 15% of my proceeds from YouTube and from Rumble and from Subscribe Star and my merchandise sales will go to Dana at the end of the month to help her. If you go directly to Dana's Give, Send, Go, which is legal defense fund for her, it's Dana Legal Defense Fund. Just look up and go to Give, Send, Go and look up Dana. If you give $100 or more to her between now and the end of the month, I will give you $15 credit, which is basically a bag of my coffee. And I will cover the shipping on that. So, in fact, let me see if I still have it in here. It says probate attorney fund, but if you go to Give, Send, Go and type in, instead of probate attorney fund, go to Give, Send, Go and type in legal defense fund. If you give $100 or more to her between now and the end of the month, I'll give you a $15 credit to anything in my merchandise catalog. And we'll make sure that Dana gets 15% of the proceeds for anything else. And I can't emphasize enough. These stories are incredibly important. And as I tell everyone with my show every time that I do one of these, fight for your freedom. It belongs to you. Fight for your liberty. It is yours. And sic semper. I'm really tired. And sic semper tyrannis.
We are go for liftoff in T-minus 30.
Stand by for further instructions, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment.
Secondary guidance systems engaged.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark.
All systems are a go. All systems are a go.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, you are over the target. You are authorized to fire at will.